Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, good morning. Okay, so we're going to talk about law and finance, and we're looking into Asian companies now. And this is a review that what we learned in a typical finance textbook assumes that, well, says that firms maximize shareholders' value, okay, but they're subject to agency problems, okay, because the concept of this agency problem is between the managers and the shareholders, right? But that's because in many Anglo-Saxon countries, well, namely US and UK, of course Australia and New Zealand, you can include them, the shareholders are typically widespread, okay? So that's why this agency problems become a problem, okay? So the managers basically control the firms, right? So that's where this agency issue comes into play. And also in textbooks, they don't write it down, but usually assumes there's a good legal system and regulation, and the market is efficient. Okay, so that's sort of the assumption. But nowadays, I know there's at least one textbook that address these problems in Asian firms. Yeah. So I think what you're learning in this course is now, gradually getting into the standard American textbooks. Okay. Yeah, so that's why we first look at the ownership of Asian firms. And this is what we were looking at. This is the paper by Laporta, Lopez, De Solanes, and Schleifer. Yeah, so it's LLS. And they look at the corporate ownership around the world. So in this paper, they look at not just Asia, but around the world. And they only look at this 27 wealthy countries. And yeah, so this is what they find, right? So this is what we saw last week. So you can see that US, UK is the only country, right, or countries that have this high proportion of widely held shareholders, which means, the shareholders are spread out. And you can see that if you add the proportion on to the right, it becomes 100%. Okay? So you can see that this is sort of US, UK is more like an exception. But if you go to the other countries, you can see that, family and the state owns quite, a large proportion of this ownership. So that's what, we found. Okay. And when we talked about this control, right? Control and ownership. Here I'll show you an example of how to, well, it's not really calculation, but yeah, it's sort of a calculation, but it's, what is the concept, right, of control rights? Okay, when a firm basically has like a pyramid structure or a cross-holding structure. So that's what we mentioned earlier, yeah, right? Like, how do owners maintain their power? And then, of course, one way is to have this superior voting rights, right? So it's like it's not one share, one vote. It's like one share, maybe many votes, right? So that's one way. But the other way to control the power or maintain the power is to have this kind of a cross-ownership pattern or pyramid structures. Okay. So when that happens, how do we measure this? Yeah. So so this is a very simple case. So the family, there's a family here, right? This family owns 11% of firm A. Okay. And the firm A owns 100% of firm B. Okay. So in this case, the family owns, right? This is you can say it's the cash flow, right? It's first the family owns 11% of firm A, and then owns. Oops, this is 100%. Sorry, this is 100%. So this is a typo. Sorry. Yeah, this was coming from the next page. Yeah. So this is supposed to be 1. So therefore, 0.11 times 1, so it's 11%, right? So if this is the case, the family will own 11% of firm B, right? Indirectly, but through firm A. So it goes this way and 100%, so that's 11%, right? because firm A owns 100% of firm B. Okay, so that's ownership. Yeah, sorry about this typo. How about the control, right? The control, this is assuming one share, one vote. Controls, okay, family owns, right, 11% of firm A, right? Okay. But this A owns 100% of firm B, right? So in that case, the family will control 11%. Right? So in that case, it's same as the ownership, right? Because in this case, it's A to B is 100%. Okay, now, how about this? Okay. So in this case, the family owns 11% of firm A, and A owns 21% of firm B. Okay? So the cash flow right is this, right? 0.11, which is 11%, times 0.21, so that's 2.3%. So family owns 2.3% of firm B. So that is, straightforward. It's cash flow rights, right? But now, what is the control rights in this case? Is it same as 2.3, or is it different? Okay, remember that if this A owns B 100%, which is this case, right? So that's 11%, right? Right? I mean, sorry, yeah. I mean, 11%. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's what I said. Oh, sorry. I have to go back again. It's not 2.3. In this case, the family owns 11%, and A owns B 100%. So I said 2.3. No, it's not. The family, in this case, family controls 11% of B. Because A is control only 11%, right? And then the A controls B 100%. So that's why the family controls 11% of firm B. Okay? Now, then the question is, how about this case? The family owns 11% of A, but now in this case, A owns 21% of B. So if A owns 100% of B, which is this case, the family controls 11%, right? So if A owns only 21%, how much would be, what's the family ownership, family control? Sorry? 2.3? 2.3 is the control, the ownership. Yeah. If you look at this example, right, this is 11%, right? Okay, this is a typo. Sorry, this family owns 2.3%. This is a typo. This is 11. This should be 11%. Yeah. Here, the control, right, is 11% because 11. This A is owned by the family owns A 11%, and then A owns B by 100. But the family controls 11%, right? In this case, it has to be lower than 11%, right? Because A and B, A to B is A only owns 21% of B. So that's why the control rights cannot be higher than 11%, right? It cannot be greater than 11%, right, compared to the previous page. Yeah, so in this case, it's not 11% times 21%. It is the weakest link in the chain of control rights, which is 11% in this case. Okay. Because the ownership is 11, right? And this is ownership is 21%. And at least the family controls A, 11%, right? But the thing is, this is 11% of control on firm A. But it does have at least 11% control on firm B. But it cannot exceed 21%, right? It cannot exceed 21 because A is only controlled by the family 11%. So it's 11%. So it's basically, it's like at least 11% they have control, okay? So it cannot exceed 11%, right? In other words, yeah, it cannot exceed 11% because A itself, right, is controlled only 11%. So that's how we think about, or you think about this, or the paper defines this ultimate control rights. Okay, so this is the simplest example. Okay. Now, how about this? Okay. So this has sort of a, what's slightly looks like a cross ownership. It's not really a crisscross ownership, but it's somewhat similar because A owns B, C owns B, right? So there are two firms that owns firm B. Okay, so start with the family again. So family owns 11% of firm A, and A owns 21% of firm B, right? And then a family owns 25% of firm C, and then C owns 7% of firm B. Okay. So the ownership of B is the family owns 11%, and then A of A, and A owns 21% of B. So therefore, ownership is 11% times 21%, right? From this root, from firm A, right? So which is 0.11 times 0.21, which is 2.3%. Here, through firm C, the family owns 25% of firm C, and then C owns 7% of firm B, right? So in this case, ownership is 0.25 times 0.07, which is 1.75, right? Yeah, 1.75. And then the total is 4.1% because you have two roots, right? Through firm A and through firm C. So if you add them together, that becomes you can say the cash flow rights. So that is 4.1%. So the family owns 4.1% of firm B. Okay, now the control rights, right? Okay, so through this firm A, the family owns 11%, right? And A owns B 21%. So as I said, from this route through firm A, the control right is the weakest link, which is 11%. Yeah. Here, right? The family owns 25% of firm C, but here you can see that the firm C only owns 7% of firm B. Okay, so in that case, the family at least controls, or you can say at most maybe, at most controls 7% of firm B through firm C. Okay. So in a sense, this is like a bottleneck, right? 7%. So from this route, through firm C, it's the control right is 7%. Okay. So therefore, what's the total control rights? 18. Yeah, it's 18 because through firm A, it's 11%, right? And then through firm C, it's 7%, so it's 18%. So that's how you compute the control rights. We can say ultimate control rights. So if you have a more complicated structure, then it becomes this computation of control right becomes a bit, complicated. So, so these are, very simple examples. So in this case, you can see that, or even in the previous example, you can see that the control rights and the cash flow rights are different, right? Here, the family owns 2.3% of firm B, right? The family's cash flow right is 2.3% for firm B, right? But control right is 11%. So 11%, which is control rights, is higher than the cash flow rights. So that's where the discrepancy, between the cash flow rights and the ownership rights, cash flow rights and the control rights happens. Okay. In this case, it's the same, right? In this case, A owns B 100%. So the family owns, again, it's a typo here. It's 0.11 times 1, so which is 11%, right? So the family controls 11%, right? Which is of firm A. So therefore, and A owns B of 100%. So therefore, family controls and owns 11%. So in this case, there's no discrepancy between the cash flow rights and the control rights. Yeah. Let me just repeat that for those of you just watching who will watch the video. Yeah. Okay. So so here in this case, there is a discrepancy, right, between the control rights and the voting rights. Okay? The cash flow right and the voting rights, or cash flow rights and the control rights. And this is just to make it a bit more complicated. Okay. So is this clear now? Okay. So in this previous example, I said there's only one share, one vote, right? But if there's more than one share, one vote, then that fact itself will, make the difference, will create the difference between controlling rights and the cash flow rights, right? But in Asia, for example, like Korea, Japan, and Singapore, does not seem to have this superior voting rights. Okay? Japan has, or some other countries may have preference shares, which doesn't have voting rights. Yeah, but there is no like a superior voting rights, which is more than one. Okay. Okay. Let me see. So this is from that paper that we're looking at. This is an example of this is from Klassen Jankov Land. This is an example of Hong Kong's Lee Ka-shing family back in 1990s. Okay, now Lee Ka-shing family has restructured the company. Yeah, so it's partly because this family sort of ownership structure was actually criticized by this person, Lam, Professor Lam, which I think you know him, right? He's a famous, I heard that he's a very famous TV personality in China. So when he was in Hong Kong initially, he was at Chinese University of Hong Kong, he actually was, and he wrote this paper, and then he did actually, sort of went to the TV, to the media, and talked about this structure. So I think his relationship with Li Ka-shing was not very good. I heard later they became good friends. But, but initially, because of this research, so he was saying, took example of Li Ka-shing's family, and he was sort of criticizing this. So you can see there's a family at the top, and then you can see this O and C, O and C. So O is ownership, right? And C is control. So here is Li Ka-shing family controls 35% of Chong Kong. So the ownership and control is the same, right? At the first here. But then if you go down, it's Hutchinson Whampoa. It's 34% ownership, but 40% control. So you can see that discrepancy, right, between the ownership and control in quite a number of cases. Not all of them, some of them are the same, but some here it's all the same except this one, right? Qi Xing is different. But you can see here Hutchinson Whampoa is different, and then Cavendish International is also different. So you can see here is Husky Oil is complicated. It's sort of held by Hutchinson, Cavendish, and also directly by the family. So you can see that there is a discrepancy here. So so this is an example of Li Ka-shing family's control. Okay, well, control and ownership. And this one is Kyuk Ho Shin family, which is Lotte. Lotte is a Korean group, which is called Chaebol. And we'll talk about Chaebol in a few weeks. Have you heard of Lotte? Yeah, you have? Yeah. I think this is they have business in China, right? Yeah. And I think they got into trouble recently, if I remember correctly. And so for me, this Lotte has a pretty big business in Japan. So they're famous with chewing gums. Yeah, chewing gums. So if you grew up in Japan as a kid, you know Lotte chewing gum, right? It's chewing gum. And also they own a baseball team. Yeah, so Lotte, I forgot the name of the baseball team, but they have, so the business presence is in Japan is quite large. But again, it's this family, right, that owns this, or controls this group. But of course, this is in the 90s, so now there might have been, a changeover. But you can see that compared to the Li Ka-shing's family, or Li Ka-shing's group, you can see that this Korean group basically looks more like a pyramid, right? It's more going down, right? There are sort of lines that go, sideways, but not too much, right? So this is a typical pyramid structure, okay? And you can see the, the ownership and control. So you can see the difference. Let me see here. It's not too much. Yeah. There are a few, like this one, right? This Pusan Finance, right? It's 32% ownership and 39% control. So there is a discrepancy here. For Lotte Japan, it's 30% ownership, 34% control. Yeah. So, but if you look at each link, the discrepancy looks like it's not as much as the one we saw for this, Li Ka-shin's family group. Okay, so these are two examples. Yeah, so the next table that I'm going to show you is again from the same paper. So basically, I'll show you the table first. So here are the East Asian countries, and then this own equals 20%. Control means con is control. Oh, sorry, go back. It means that the average minimum percent of the common equity required to control 20% of the vote. So, which means that if it's one share, one vote, this will be, 20%. But if it's, oops, sorry. If it's less, then there's slightly more control than ownership rights. Okay, but you can see from this these numbers in the first column that most of them are very close to 20%, right? So it means that at least to control 20%, you are holding close to 20% of the shares. But the thing is, you can see Philippines, Hong Kong, Indonesia is slightly lower than 20%, right? So that means that means on average, you can hold less than 20%, right? To control 20% of the firm. But it's pretty close to 20%. The lowest one is Philippines. Yeah. Okay, the next one, the pyramid with ultimate owner. So this is saying that in these countries that you see, what percentage have a pyramid structure. Okay, so how do you define pyramid structure in this case is basically percentage of companies if the controlling owner exercises control through at least one publicly traded company. Yeah. So in that case, this is how they define the pyramid structure. Cross-holdings is basically percentage of companies if the company has a controlling shareholder and owns any amount of shares in its controlling shareholder or in any other company in that chain of control. Okay, so let's look at this. So pyramid structure seems more prevalent in these countries. Like Indonesia is pretty high, right? Singapore also high. And Thailand is the lowest, at least in this group of countries. And cross-holdings is Malaysia and Singapore. With Japan, surprisingly, people have known Japanese company groups as cross-holdings, but from this definition, it's only 11%. That's probably because the there are more listed companies, right? So that's why, in case of Japan, the number of companies is much bigger. Listed number of companies is bigger. So that's why the cross-holded companies, they belong to certain groups, but if you compare the other companies, because there are so many other independent companies, let's put it that way, so that's why the percentage is relatively, lower. But in terms of the market value, these cross-held groups probably has a larger market value. But if you just count the numbers of these companies that has cross-holdings, then, because there are other, independent companies, so that's why the percentage is low. Okay. Then the controlling owner alone, so this means that controlling owner is the percentage of companies if there does not exist a second owner who hold at least 10% of the stock. Okay. So that means, this one person is holding, right, 10%, more than 10%. So that, if you look at that, then you can see that, the controlling is more, you can say this is like a concentration is quite high in Hong Kong, right? Also, Japan is high. Yeah, Korea is high. But still like 1/3, right? Even Philippines, Singapore, more than 1/3 of the companies have this, controlling owner, which is one largest owner. The next one is management. Management is when it's the percentage of companies the CEO, board chairman, or vice chairman are from the controlling family. Okay, in this case, it's a family. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so you can see that the family, owns quite a large number of firms in Asia, where Japan is lower in that respect, or the lowest. So basically, this shows that in East Asian companies, you can see that the pyramid, or especially pyramid structure. So some company owns through some other company, right? It's like a vertical link. So that structure is quite prevalent. Cross-holding apparently is a bit less, and and the controlling owner is quite large for some countries. So this is basically, like, well, this shows that either family, right, or this ownership structure, or concentration, right, is there. So it's not, doesn't look like it's well dispersed. Okay, so these are these Asian countries. And then this is a table that we already saw earlier. So you can see, right? So this is the cash flow rights, voting rights, right? So this is for the largest controlling shareholder. Okay, let me see here. And what we are going to look at is this ratio, right? So this cash flow right versus voting rights. And you can see that the voting right is a control right. You can see the ratio right here. So if it's, the ownership and the voting right is equal, then this ratio should be 1, right? But the thing is, the voting rights or control rights is generally greater. okay? So that's why this ratio is lower than 1. So that's what, we saw. Okay. Okay. So this is a table. It's only done for Asian firms. So before we saw this for the global companies, right? But here, this Klassen, Jankoff, and Lan looks at only the East Asian firms. And the columns are the same as, the previous paper. So widely held, right? So in Japan, 42% of the ownerships is widely held, right? So in case of, the dispersion, Japan is the largest, but yet it's 42%, right? In UK or US, it was like 80%, 90%, okay? And in case of Japan, you can see that 38% is held by financial institutions, okay? This is because the financial institutions, especially banks, are pretty strong in Japan, like in Germany, right? So the banks actually can hold shares. Unlike many other countries, it's prohibited, right? The banks, commercial banks usually cannot hold shares, okay? But in Japan, they are allowed to hold to a certain extent. There is an upper limit, but they can hold it. Okay. So that's one reason. And then the other thing is like insurance companies. See, these are financial institutions, so they do invest, right? As an investment, they hold shares. So that's why this proportion is quite large in Japan. Okay. And Korea is 14% widely held. But if you look at other countries, it's quite low, right? It's like less than 3%. Instead, the family ownership, as we seen earlier, is quite high, right? State ownership is high in Singapore. This is because of the sovereign funds in Singapore. They, like sovereign funds called, like, well-known one is like a Temasek Holdings. And there's it's called GIC, Government Investment Corporation of Singapore. So they hold it in a sense like investment, right? But these are state-controlled funds. So that's why the state ownership is quite high. Okay. So that's how it looks like. Yeah, so this is when you use the 10% cutoff. If you use the 20% cutoff, then it becomes these numbers become much higher, right? Let me see. 20%, yeah. Well, maybe it doesn't change that much, but slightly. Yeah. Okay, so this is how it looks like in East Asian countries. Okay, let's see. Okay, so so going back to this LLSD, the original paper, right, that we saw last week. So here, they actually look at the concentration globally, and then try to figure out why do companies, right, in countries with poor investor protection have more concentrated ownership. Okay, so basically they're trying to link the origin of law, right? Remember that common law countries had the best shareholder protection as well as creditor protection. Well, the creditor protection, I think the Scandinavian and German law group has higher scores, but usually it's the common law countries, right, which has the good shareholder protection. So why do shareholders, right, are more concentrated in regions where they have lower protection for investors? So first of all, they say that large or dominant shareholders basically monitor the managers, right? Of course, if it's from the same family, they may not have to monitor, but if they are not, then they need to own more capital or have more ownership to exercise their control rights, right? So therefore, if the manager behaves in different ways, then they can at least have some control. So that is one of the reasons. But if the shareholders and the controlling, the dominant shareholders and the management is the same, which means from the same family, then the second reason might apply, right? Which means that the minority shareholders might be expropriated. So therefore, they might not want to invest in these companies. So therefore, the small shareholders won't buy these firms. So that's why the ownership is concentrated, right? So basically, you cannot attract the dispersed shareholders. So that's the second reason. Yeah. So either way, if the investors are not well protected, then the ownership will be, more concentrated. So that's the reasons. These are the reasons. Okay. So here it's LLSD. So they will look at the concentration. They compare the concentration. So highest concentration of ownership is found in the French civil laws, which is expected because French civil law countries had the weakest investor protection. And here they look at the three largest shareholders, average ownership of the three largest shareholders, which is 54% for the 10 largest non-government firms. So they only look at the 10 largest non-government firms, and then the three largest shareholders own average of 54%. It's more than half. Okay? And the lowest concentration is the German civil law. Okay. It's not the common law countries. So the reason they give is that low concentration comes from East Asia, where company law has been significantly influenced by US rather than Germany, Austria, or Switzerland. So this is probably true after the Second World War because especially for Japan, was occupied by the US, and US basically wrote the constitution, as well as these commercial laws. So basically, some of these commercial laws originated from one of the states in the US. Yeah, so that's why it has been influenced by the US law, company law. Yeah. And okay, so this is the actual ownership. So you can see that English origin average, the ownership, the mean is 43%. right? And then French origin is 54%. This is at the bottom of the table. That's the average. And then German origin is 34%, and the Scandinavian is 37%, right? So German origin average is the lowest. And as you can see, that's probably true because Japan and South Korea is relatively, and also Taiwan is, these East Asian countries in the German origin group has lower ownership, right? So that's why these three Asian countries is basically pulling down the average of these German origin countries. But if you take that away, I think this will be much higher, right? So then English origin is like 43%. So maybe if you take away these German, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan from this group, then it could become higher, right? Because Australia is 58, Germany is 48%. Switzerland is 41, so it's obviously it would be above 40%. Yeah. Okay, so that's what they find. So comparing this, origin of law, they find that, well, concentration is effectively the lowest, right? If you exclude those East Asian countries, the common law countries have the lowest concentration. Okay. Okay. So the next thing is this, right? So anyway, okay, any questions up to here? Is that all right? Okay, so if investors are well protected, the story goes, well, it's probably easier to finance, right? To finance externally, right? Basically, if the investors are well protected, well, shareholders and creditors, then they are happy to, provide financing. Basically, happy to buy the shares, happy to provide loans, happy to buy the bonds, right? So it's easier for the firms to finance their investment. So the question is that true? Right? It's a simple question. So then this is like a sequence of papers by LLSB. So this is a paper called Legal Determinants of External Finance. So it was published in Journal of Finance in 1997. So so what they find is quite straightforward. Countries with poor investor protections measured by character of legal rules and the quality of law enforcement have smaller and narrower capital markets, right? So basically countries with poor investor protections have narrower capital markets. Okay. And the French civil law countries have both the weakest investor protection and the least developed capital markets. And this is compared to, common law countries. Okay. So that's their finding. So which is consistent with, their story. Okay. So let's look at this. Yeah, this slide is a bit small, but what they're looking at is, so they look at okay, so here, right, so the first panel, these are all the English origin countries, right? And then the next one here is the French origin. And then the next one is German origin. And then the last part is the Scandinavian. So therefore, 1, 2, 3, 4 groups. And then this yellow column, right? This is the, yellow row. The first one is the English origin average. So this is just the average of all the English origin countries, right? So that here you have the French and the German average and Scandinavian average. The first column is external capital over GDP. So this is for the whole country. Yeah, this is looking at the, not the individual firms. This is looking at the aggregate number for each country. So this is basically how much the firm or the corporate sector has raised externally. This is, okay, let me see. Which year? Okay. Okay, I forgot to say from which year, but yeah, this is an average, probably from in the 90s. You can see that average like 60%, right? External capital over GDP is 60%. If you go down to the French average, it's only 21%, okay? German origin is 46, and Scandinavian average is 30%. So you can see that the French origin countries have raised capital externally compared to the GDP at a much lower rate. And if you look at number of domestic firms per population, this is the second column, we can see that there are much more companies, right, in this English origin countries. Okay. And French origin has the least. And this is IPO, initial public offerings, per population. As you can see, English origin is high, 2.23. But of course, Scandinavian is also 2.14. It's quite high. But in this case, the German origin has the lowest IPO. This is partly because many of these countries, like especially Germany and Japan, it's more bank dominated. Right? So they do raise externally, but they raise more from banks rather than from the share market. So that's why IPO is lower. And if you look at the debt, well, debt is basically, right, you can say it's a corporate debt, is 68% in, this is how much they raise over GDP. Let me see, it may not be how much they raise. I think it could be the outstanding amount of debt over GDP is 68%, right? And you can see that German origin is 97, right? So this is outstanding amount of debt over GDP. From the corporate sector, you can see 97% is high for German origin because it's mostly coming from bank financing, okay? And you can see, let me see, yeah. Yeah. So like Japan is 4.13, right? It's relatively high. Germany is not as high, yeah. But South Korea is quite high, 9.52. Taiwan is extremely high, 11. Yeah. Okay, so this is the size of, the next column is the size of the GDP. We'll talk about the growth in the next paper, so I will just skip this column. And the last four columns is basically coming from the LLSB 1997 JF paper about this rule of law. They have all the scores of the rule of law for each country. And then anti-director rights, one share, one vote, creditor rights. So these are, made it into a score. Okay, so the higher the score, the better. So So you can see that rule of law is the highest for, well, it's not the highest, it's higher than the French law, 6.46. The rule of law is the highest for the German origin, right? So here are all these scores. So especially in anti-creditor rights, you can see the English origin country has the highest, right? As we saw before in the JPE paper. Okay, so this basically table shows that, well, it looks like countries that have better investor protection, right, can raise more external financing. Okay, so this is looking at the whole country, entire country. And the same paper now use individual firms. Okay, so instead of looking at the macro number, they look at they use the. Oh, wait a minute. This is still macro. Sorry, yeah. The next one is at the firm level. This one is still the country level. But what they do is they run a regression. Okay? They run a regression. So the dependent variable is external capital over GNP, which is basically this one. Okay, the first column. Okay, and the explanatory variable is, they use the GDP growth, GDP size. Log of GNP is the size of the country, GNP, and here is the rule of law, right? So we have remember the scores that we had on this previous table. This is the rule of law, right? And then you have either French, German, Scandinavian origin, okay? So this is a dummy variable, which is 1 if your country belongs to one of these, origins. Why don't we have English origin here? This is an econometric question for you. Right? Here, it's a dummy variable, right? 1 if it's French origin, if you belong to that, right? So you put 1, right? So these are, you can think of these as like a data, right? In the regression. So if you're in the French, you put 1. If you're in German, you put 1. And then you're Scandinavian, you put 1, right? And otherwise, it's 0, right? But how come you don't have the English origin in the regression? I mean, how come we don't have this English origin as a dummy variable? Does anyone know? It's included in the model, yeah. But how is it reflected? Okay? If you put all 4, then your computer will say, I cannot compute. There will be an error message. Okay, so what in a regression, if you have like, in this case, you have 4 classifications, right? Because of the 4 legal origins. And then when you run a regression, basically, let's say if you ignore this GDP growth, log GNP, and this rate of rule of law, just let's say if you run a regression based only on these three 3 dummy variables. Okay, so then what it does is basically it's a dummy variable, it's just one level, right? So if you are looking at the whole sample, right, and then you draw basically, so then you can compute the mean, right, of the whole sample, right? And then let's say you take the French origin and you take the mean, right? And then the mean will be somewhere, right? And then the German will be there somewhere, right? Scandinavian will be there somewhere, right? But then you already know the average of the whole sample, so you can figure out from the whole sample the English origin, right? So which means that because you know the whole sample mean, so therefore if you can sort out the 3 means from these 3 groups, the English origin will be reflected in the remaining, okay? So that's why if you put 4 of them, then you have too much information, right? This means linear dependence in linear models. You might have heard of this. So that's why the computer cannot solve this, right? So here in this regression, the intercept is important. Intercept, okay? From this intercept, intercept is like if you draw a picture of this regression, usually you have this line going up like this, and there's an intercept here, right? Yeah. But then French origin has negative, right? You see it's negative, right? So which means that compared to the intercept, it shifts down. The line shifts down, which means the mean is lower, right? But what is the mean? We're looking at the external capital over GNP. So that means for the French origin, the line shifts downward, which means that the external capital over GNP for French origin on average is lower. That's what it means. Compared to the English origin, because English origin is basically, you can say it's like the intercept. So it's relatively to the English origin. French origin has lower average external GNP. After controlling for these factors like GDP growth, GNP, rule of law, and anti-director rights, yeah. So that's what it means. So that's why German is same, right? And Scandinavian is same. So this, if you run a regression, the external capital over GNP for English origin is, you can consider, is higher than compared to other groups. Okay, so that's what it means. So that's why here, first of all, you don't put all 4, right? So that's a technical issue. But how to interpret this is when you have this significant, right, negative coefficients on the dummy variable. It means that you are comparing against this intercept. So that basically the line is shifting, right? Parallel shifting. Intercept is shifting like this. Right? Okay, so here what they're also doing is they include these anti-director rights, right? So here in the first regression, they don't include the French, German, Scandinavian origin, but they have this anti-director rights. So and the coefficient on anti-director rights is positive, right, and significant. In this case, it's 1 star at 1% level, yeah, which is quite significant. And then you can see, which means that if the anti-director right is higher, then it increases the external financing, right? It's positive. Okay, so then in the second regression, what they do is instead of using the anti-director rights, they include one share, one vote. Right? So this is coming from this previous table. They're basically using these columns, right? One share, one vote, anti-director rights. They're putting these scores into the regression. So again, one share, one vote, then you have positive coefficient, statistically significant, which means that if the countries with one share, one vote have greater external capital, okay? And then in the third column, what they do is they put these dummies, right, of the origin. So you can see that this is what I said. These are all negative, right? So basically, this is showing that the intercept is shifting downwards for these three origins. So therefore, it's relatively to the English origin. Okay. And then the fourth column, what they do is this. They put all this together. So with this, origin of law plus anti-director rights, right? So not all of them, yeah, sorry. When they include this, then you can see that this coefficient on anti-director right is positive, but it's smaller, right? It's 0.0675 compared to when you include this independently, which is 0.1171. So the explanatory power is going down, has gone down, but still significant. But then you compare with this, right? So what happened to this origin, right? French origin, German origin. So French origin, the dummy coefficient has gone down from -3.2 to, well, in a sense, it's going up, but the sensitivity, right, has gone down to 0.21. And then for German origin, actually this becomes not significant, right? So this becomes, it's not significantly different from zero, okay? So it's not statistically significant. This Scandinavian origin is still significant, but you can see this 3.3, right? 0.33 has become -0.2816 because this anti-director right is basically explaining this external capital at the same time as these dummies. Because we know that anti-director right, is also part of this law, right? So if in good countries with good legal system, then typically anti-director right is also good. So that's why this is basically sharing the explanatory power. So that's why these dummies, right, the coefficient on dummies in the third column becomes smaller if you include anti-director rights. Yeah. And especially German origin became non-significant, which means that anti-director rights is explaining more, yeah, than this German origin. In other words, this origin of law and anti-director rights, or the last column, one share, one vote, basically you can say in statistical terms they are correlated. They are correlated, right? If you put variables that are correlated with each other, then the coefficient typically becomes smaller. Okay? So that's what happened for these dummy variables, the coefficient on dummy variables for this origin of law. So finally, in the last column, they added a one share, one vote, right? In case of one share, one vote, it's probably not much correlated with the origin of law, so that you can see that the coefficients, right? You compare the coefficient on the dummies in the third column and the last column, you can see that, the coefficient has not changed, or even some of them become bigger, right? Yeah, so, so in this case, this is indirectly showing that one share, one vote is probably not that much correlated with this, either of this, origin of law. Okay. You can say that this one share, one vote has more, independent explanatory power. In case of anti-director rights, since the German origin has gone down, right? So it could mean that this anti-director rights is more correlated with this German origin. Yeah, so well, it's not very clear just by looking at this, but it's probably because it's a it's a regression, so it's multi-dimensional, so it's not easy to see directly, but that's what it means. Yeah. So that's basically, when you run a regression, you can see the relationship between all these, explanatory variables much clearer than just looking at this table. Okay. Let me see what, it's already 10 minutes. Okay, so let me stop here, yeah, and continue on Thursday. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
What are the number in the brackets?
Oh, these are p-values.
Control is higher, right, usually. Yeah. So in this case, you might have some shares which have no voting. This is right? The first one. Or it could be preference. I'm not sure.
I think this is preference shares. The ownership should be higher than the
No. The control becomes relatively high. Because this preference shares is probably not issued, not by the family.
not higher than 20. Yes, I think so. And this is at beginning, so and there is not pyramid structure between the family and the.
It's not the one we are saying. Yeah. But we cannot tell from this line. But it could be preference shares. They could have shares that have no control. Right?
Yes, I have. I have thought about the preference shares, but I thought preference shares are held by this family, so maybe the ownership should be higher than the